This is Chapter 12, the 15th Century Toward the Renaissance. As we move away from all of the tragedies of the 14th century, including the Great Schism, the Hundred Years' War, and of course the bubonic plague, all of Europe is still recovering from the bubonic plague, and as they do, we see a shift in the way the world is set up. Instead of feudalism and instead of with one ruling family, monarchy in some countries, more representative in others, but we see the emergence of capitalism. And so now with that rising middle class that Chaucer represented for us in the Canterbury Tales, then we are able to see this, and more people are able to make their own way and make their own money. So we see more prosperity, and with that comes patronage of the arts. Just like today, the wealthy people are the ones who are able to sponsor the artist, to buy the artwork. And so that is very important as we move towards the Renaissance, because now we have the painters who can paint for a living. It's not something they just do on the side or do in homage to the church. They are able to make it their life work to paint. And so that changes the character of the artwork. The two main cities for prosperity and for patronage of the arts during this time period were Bruges in Flanders, which is an area of modern-day Belgium today, and then Florence in Italy. We are first going to talk about art in Northern Europe in the area where Bruges is located. And the art in this area is not just from Bruges, but also from Ghent and Antwerp and Brussels. And the art, this is what is in modern day Netherlands and Belgium. And one thing that is noted here is there is a reciprocity of style, meaning that the artwork produced here was very similar to the artwork that was produced in Italy. That the styles were so much alike that they could have just been replaced with one another, so they were reciprocal. It's called the International style. A prominent painter during this time period is Jan van Eyck, and we will look at his painting in just a moment. Another area where art was prominent was at the court of the Duke of Burgundy, and this is in Dijon. It was then in Burgundy. It's now modern-day France. The Duke of Burgundy was Philip the Bold. He reigned from 1363 to 1404, and he was very much a patron of the arts. And two pieces that we will look at from his time period and from his region of the world are Claus Sluiter's Well of Moses and the Limburg brothers' Tres Riches Eres. This painting, Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, is a painting of a real couple. It was done in Bruges in Flanders, but it is of an Italian couple. He was an Italian man who worked for the very powerful Medici family in Florence, and he worked in the banking industry in Bruges, and so he was wealthy and was able to commission this painting by Jan van Eyck of Bruges. And in this painting, it's a secular painting. So this is a shift from a lot of the religious painting that we have seen. And it's serving as a contract between the two. It is serving as a document to record either their marriage or possibly where he was transferring the legal rights to his wife to act in his behalf in their finances when he was away on business. And above the mirror at the very back of the painting, you see where Arnolfini has signed his name. And so that is serving as a legal document, which is very interesting. And this shows us a little bit about the times. So some of the symbolism in the painting would include the dog, which represents fidelity, being faithful to the marriage vows, the green in her dress, which symbolizes fertility. And I know it appears as if she is pregnant, but I don't believe that she is. I believe that is just the style of the time with some of the things I have read about this painting. And then the fact that they do not have shoes on symbolizes the holy ground on which the marriage takes place. So it does show us a lot about the customs, the fashions, and the environment during this time period. This sculpture, entitled The Well of Moses, was by Claus Sluiter, and it was an actual working well. It was the water source for the monks at a monastery that Philip the Bold had built in Dijon. And Claus Sluiter was the sculptor who was commissioned to putting sculptures all over the monastery. So this one is the most famous. You see Moses in the foreground, and if you'll note closely, what appear to be horns on Moses' head. Those are not horns. Those are like a halo type effect, that it was because God spoke directly to Moses, gave him the 10 commandments. It's like rays of light that shoot out from his head. We will see this in another depiction of the Renaissance, and sometimes it's misinterpreted, but it really means that Moses is more holy, not that those are horns coming out of his head. But we also have other statues from the Old Testament: David, Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah. And those are all what is on the base of this statue. And then we have the angels that you can see, the 4 weeping angels. And then what we cannot see is that also sculpted here, it's from a larger work that includes the crucified Christ, the Virgin Mary, St. John, and Mary Magdalene. This is a page from what is called the most famous illuminated manuscript in the history of art. Remember that an illuminated manuscript is where we have a book that is copied. The words are copied, but there are also illustrations that are done all on the pages between the text and around the text. The letters are done in calligraphy script, so very beautiful. This was commissioned from Philip the Bold's brother, John, and the title of the work that it comes from, and please forgive my French, is Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, which means the very sumptuous hours of the Duke de Berry. It is a book of hours, which was something that was used by the nobility as a prayer book. So it included psalms, it had litanies, and those are readings from the Catholic Church, and liturgical passages that were to be cited at certain hours of the day. It also had a calendar, and so this page is from the calendar. So while it was a holy book, the pages of the calendar were painted with very secular themes, and that's what you see here, taken from the month of May. We have the greeting of spring, and so we have the May Day celebration with them all dressed in their green, symbolizing spring, and they are heralding. You see that the trumpets that herald the beginning of spring. You have the astrological signs there above it, which is, interesting in a holy book. And then what you notice behind our figures in the background, this is the Louvre. The Louvre, that very famous museum in Paris, France, which at that time was a medieval palace. And if you go to the Louvre today, if you go in the basement of the Louvre, you will see the remnants of that palace. And that is what is painted in the background here, which I think is very interesting. So we're starting to see a little bit of a break from the religious themes. While still prevalent, they are not the only thing that we see. And this is one of those representations of that fact. While there were the stirrings of the Renaissance in Northern Europe, as we have just looked at, we have to look further to the south to see the city where it said that the Renaissance began. It is said that the Renaissance began in Florence, Italy. There were a number of reasons for this. First of all, Florence is the city that connected Rome, and of course Rome was important because it was the seat of power for the Catholic Church, that connected Rome with the north, so with the rest of continental Europe. There was a very strong language in Florence, and remember, we're getting away from the Latin. That was the language of the government and the church of the Middle Ages, and that language was Italian, and Italian had been set forth by Dante in the Divine Comedy and by Petrarch. Remember him, he wrote the sonnets that were based around Laura. We looked at him in chapter 11. So because of the background of that language, it was a language that was spoken across Europe. And then we had the trade guilds. Remember that a guild is a group of men, in this case, who come together. They have the same occupation, and they worked together to secure that occupation, to kind of like a modern day union, to fight for their group and to take care of their members. So in the trade guilds, there were 12 artistic trade guilds in Florence that were very powerful. And then we have this representative government from the 7 senior guilds. Of those 12 guilds, 7 were the major ones. And so men from each one of those guilds formed the government for the city of Florence. So it is a representative government, not a monarchy, not a dictatorship. And so that produced a stronger city. And then, of course, Florence was a very rich city. It is the center of the European banking system. Florin, which is Florin, which is, we get the name Florence from that. The florin is a gold coin that was used as the standard currency across Europe. And then the word bank comes from banco, which is an Italian word which was begun in Florence. They were just ahead of their time in the way the banking industry was run, with borrowing and lending, charging interest so that banks could make money. So that they were the center of the European banking system for several centuries. And so that is what caused them to be where the Renaissance began. But then there's this intangible. The intangible is the fact that all of the big artists, for some unknown reason, were born and lived around Florence during this same time period. So artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli and Raphael and Fra Angelica, for unknown reasons, they all lived around Florence in the same time period. So it was just a beehive of activity for anything artistic. For most of the 15th century, Florence was controlled by the Medici family, and so that's why it's called the Medici era. They were a wealthy banking family based in Florence, but they had banks in London, Naples, Cologne, Geneva, Lyons, Basel, Avignon, Bruges, Antwerp, Lubeck, Bologna, Rome, Pisa, and Venice. So you see how incredibly wealthy they were. They controlled Florence from 1434 to 1492. And in addition to being very wealthy, they were also very well-read, cultured. They had studied the classics of ancient Greece and Rome, and they were very much into art. So they provided patronage to the arts. And, you know, some say they were responsible for the Renaissance because they provided the money for the artists to be able to paint and to be publicized so that people would know, and then more people would ask them to paint. So the Medici family, you cannot underestimate the importance of them when you discuss the Florentine Renaissance. The first Medici to make a name for himself in banking was Cosimo, and Cosimo was considered a man of letters in that he studied the ancient Greek and Roman text, and he had people who copied these texts for him to add to his personal library, and they copied in a very neat cursive print that is our modern day italics. That's where the name comes from, is because that is the print he had his copyists used. And his works form the core of the great humanist collection that's housed today in the Laurentian Library in Florence. So he had many works that were copied, and he studied them, and he was so enthralled, in particular with Plato, that he founded an academy to study Plato. And the scholars there so much enjoyed the works and enjoyed fellowship with one another that's where we get our term Platonic love. That's where it comes from, is from this academy that Cosimo began. And Cosimo felt guilty for his banking fortune because the fortune had been made on charging interest to borrow money, which is commonplace today, but it was new then. And it was considered a sin in the Catholic Church. The sin is of usury, U-S-U-R-Y. Today, we might call it being a loan shark because of the exorbitant interest that they charge to lend their money. And to atone for his sin of usury, that is why he lavished so much money on the artist, because he had the artist paint and sculpt things for the church. And that's why we have the Sistine Chapel that is so covered with artwork. And of course, the Vatican itself. And then the chapel in Florence, the Florence Cathedral, was covered with artwork because he was trying to atone for his sins. And each one of the de Medicis has a particular artist that they are associated with, that they spent the most money on. And Cosimo spent the most money on Donatello, who was a sculptor, and we will see a little bit more of his sculptures later in this presentation. When Cosimo died in 1464, his son Piero took over as the ruler of Florence, and he was sick from the very beginning. He had gout quite badly, and so sometimes he is called Piero the Gouty. He only ruled for 5 years, and he gave patronage to Botticelli. And Botticelli was one of the main artists of the Renaissance, and we'll look at his Adoration of the Magi and the Birth of Venus a little later. But Piero also continued patronage of Donatello and began patronage of Ficino, who was a translator. He translated Plato's works into Latin. During Piero's reign, it was a time of a lot of turmoil, a lot of political activity, and a lot of powerful families who were all vying for control of Florence. Since Cosimo had died, they thought that the time was right for them to perhaps take over control of Florence. And the most prominent of these families was the Pazzi family. And the Pazzis had a long-standing feud with the de Medicis and wanted to achieve power. So when Piero died, his 2 sons took over, Lorenzo and Giuliano. They were co-rulers of Florence, but the Pazzis saw an opportunity to perhaps take control for themselves, and so they had backing of several other rival families, but they also were backed by the Pope. Remember that here, all of the cities in Italy at this time were city-states, so it's not a unified government of Italy. Each area of Italy, the city-states, were vying for control, and the Pope would back one or the other of them, whoever he thought had the most control, because there was also a popish army. The Pope had an army to fight for control as well. So it's pretty significant that the Pazzis were backed by the Pope at the time, Pope Sixtus IV. So what the Pazzis did, they attacked the Medicis during High Mass in the Florence Cathedral on April 26, 1478. So they did it in front of 100,000 witnesses. And it did not go as well as they planned, because both brothers were not killed. One brother, Giuliano, was killed, but Lorenzo escaped with only a stab wound, and he was the one who went on to become ruler. The Pazzis, of course, were found out. They were tried and they were executed for what they did to Lorenzo. After Giuliano was killed by the Pazzis, Lorenzo became the sole ruler after his brother was assassinated. He contributed more than anyone else to the arts in Florence, and his rule became known as the Laurentian era because he was so significant. He ruled for most of the second half of the 15th century in Florence, and he was called Lorenzo the Magnificent for all that he did for the arts. Notice who he supported: the big guns, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. So that alone is enough to reserve his place in history as a great ruler. But also, he was an accomplished poet in his own right. He published a book of poetry, and he tried to write in the sonnet tradition that had been begun by Petrarch. His book of poetry, commentary on some love sonnets that he began in 1476. And there is one particular sonnet that he is most associated with, that is probably his most famous sonnet. It is called the Song of Bacchus. We will look at this in class, but it's on page 384 in your textbook. And another thing that he was known for was that he rebuilt the University of Pisa. So he is involved in intellectual pursuits, in artistic pursuits, of course, in political pursuits and in banking pursuits. And he kept peace in Florence for, some 30, 40 years, and that allowed for more artists to be able to produce. It is said of Lorenzo that he was ugly with a big nose and a raspy voice. So I looked for a sculpture of him, and this is what I found. So this is just an idea of what Lorenzo the Magnificent looked like. Fra Savonarola was a priest in Florence during the time of the reign of the Medicis. And as the arts were flourishing, he was against the arts. He said that they were not paying enough attention to the church, and he preached a more medieval theology, which was looking to the afterlife and very strict code of conduct, and anything that was beautiful or that enhanced the present day was considered sinful by him. He preached against the sinful vanities of the art and culture of his time, and what he would require was that his followers would bring anything that was not spiritual, not Christian, that they would bring anything secular, whether that be a secular book or whether that be a painting that was not about anything religious, and burn it in the city square. And it came to be known as the bonfire of the vanities, because they were burning these things he considered vain. He was called to Lorenzo's deathbed in 1492, and because Lorenzo would not give up power to him, he refused to give him the last rites. And, having the last rites is very important if you're a Catholic, so that you can confess your sins and be forgiven of your sins, and go to heaven, not go to purgatory. But he would not give him the last rites because he wouldn't give over power to him. So Lorenzo died, and Fra Savonarola took power. He became ruler of the city from 1492 to 1498. And during that time period, he had a lot of loyal followers, including Botticelli, who burned some of his paintings that were not religious in nature, Mirandola, who burned some of his works that were not religious, and he was cited for heresy by the Pope because he was so self-righteous. He thought that he was the only one who had the right way, so much so that he even said about the Pope that the Pope's house was a house of prostitution, and he called the Pope an infidel. Well, the Pope was not happy with this and called on him to recant those words, and he did not. He even went more strongly and said how the Pope was a heretic. And so he was cited for heresy. Fra Savonarola was, and he was executed in 1498. He was strangled, quartered, and burned in the town square, the same town square where he had his bonfire of the vanities. As already noted, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and it is a rebirth of classical ideals. Remember that the word classical means relating to ancient Greece and Rome. And so they would take those works and they would study them, rewrite them, and then do their own take on those works. There is an emphasis on human intellectual effort. And this is in contrast to the Middle Ages, where the emphasis was on God and what God did in the afterlife. Now it's on the present day and what mankind can do. There is a pursuit of glory and fame, and some say that the word Renaissance or rebirth, which means, the light coming forth after the Dark Ages, is a reaction against the Middle Ages. That came from a historian, Burckhardt, but some have questioned that idea that the Renaissance is a rebirth after the dormant period following the fall of the Roman Empire. So, there's a little bit of debate among historians about that, but no one can debate the fact that there was just an outpouring of artistic endeavor during this time period of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. The individual is ennobled. There's a lot of social and religious reform. The emphasis is on the good life, and which does not completely go against the theology of the Middle Ages, because most of these artists of the Renaissance acknowledged God, acknowledged that God was the creator of their gift. So it's not a complete break with theology or the Catholic Church, as sometimes people think, because the Renaissance is also called modernism. It is said that this is when our modern culture began. And you can see that as you see some of the works, particularly the writings of this time period, which do ennoble the individual, which do give more freedom to the individual. But that doesn't mean that it completely goes away from God. So it is an interesting time period, and it's one that really shapes our world today as we know it. One of the main writers of Renaissance humanism was Pico della Mirandola, hereafter just known as Pico. He was a close friend of Lorenzo de' Medicis, and he was an intellectual scholar, so much so that he determined to read everything that had been written in the ancient languages of Greek and Latin, and he also studied ancient Hebrew so that he could read the Talmud, the book associated with Judaism. So by the age of 20, he was ready with his 900 theses, which in each one of these thesis sentences summed up all of the current learning and speculation. And so he summed up all of the past learning and related it to current learning and put forth new ideas that he wanted to defend at the Vatican in Rome. So he was prepared to defend, and he was not able to. They would not let him. So he returned home discouraged. But what he left us is the preface to his 900 Theses. It's called The Oration on the Dignity of Man. We will be looking at this in class, and it is considered the first and the most important work of Renaissance humanism, in that it paved the way for other writers during this time period. The main reason that the humanist ideal spread so quickly and so widely was the invention of the printing press. The printing press was invented by Johann Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany in 1454. And with this, they no longer had to have the books copied by hand by the monks in the monasteries. They were able to print their books. And of course, the first thing printed was the Bible. And the Bible still is the most widely printed book of the day. And the Gutenberg Bible that's what it's called today, and it's in the collection in Washington, D.C., and only 48 copies of that original printing have survived. Now, as the printing press spread across Europe, one particular innovation of the printing press was in 1494 with Aldus, and so he upgraded and updated the printing press, and it became known as the Aldine Press in Italy. And so as people became more accustomed to the print materials, then humanist learning was fueled. More people became literate because now they had books that they could read. And so these ideas were spread to more and more people. And it furthered the intellectual movements of the day, both social and religious. Of course, the invention of the printing press was one of the main things that fueled the Protestant Reformation, which was in 1517. And that's it. We're going to talk about two main writers during this time period, Machiavelli and Erasmus, both humanist writers with very different takes. But I would be remiss if I did not mention what your book mentions about women during the Renaissance. Women as a whole were excluded from this. They were not allowed to paint. They didn't write. There is one notable exception, and that is Laura Serreta, and she was Italian as well, and we have a couple of her writings in the textbook. But by and large, it was still a patriarchal society, and most of the artists, like 99% of the artists, were all men. So Machiavelli is from Florence, Italy, and he was very political, and sometimes he was in favor, sometimes out of favor. He was against the Medicis, and so you see when the Medicis were in power is when he was exiled. So he was exiled from Florence, and that is when he wrote The Prince. Now, The Prince is not a nice Christian moral code that was what like Erasmus wrote, like you would expect to see, but it was instead a study in political power, specifically in how to get power and how to keep power. He modeled The Prince on a man called Caesar Borgia. Caesar was the illegitimate son of the Pope, and as such, he had a lot of power and a lot of land, but he wanted more power and more land, more so that he used a lot of unscrupulous practices to gain power and land, including luring his brother to a castle on the Adriatic Sea, and because they were fighting against one another, and he told his brother that he was going to surrender. When his brother got there, it was an ambush, and he killed his brother and all of his troops. So that's the kind of man we're talking about here. It is considered the first secular study of political theory, and it's all about the practical use of power. We will be looking at this in class. You do have some excerpts in your book. I'll probably be bringing more, but the theme is the practical use of power. How do you get power? How do you keep power? And Machiavelli said that you use any means possible to get and keep that power. So, of course, he was condemned by the Catholic Church and excommunicated. Today, the term Machiavellian is still used. You may hear it in the news. It's usually used in reference to politicians. And if you call somebody Machiavellian, it is not a compliment. It means that they are ruthless and will do anything to get power. Erasmus has been called the most important Christian humanist in Europe. He was from Holland. He was educated in Latin as a young boy, and he did enter service as a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. But he really did not practice as a priest for any long period of time. Instead, he went to the University of Paris, where he learned a lot about humanist thought. He wanted to combine classical learning with a simple approach to Christian living. And so that is what he studied and what he wrote about. He wrote The Praise of Folly, which is a lighthearted look at social evils, and he wrote it while he was at the home of Sir Thomas More, who was from England, who was an advocate of the Protestant Reformation, who later lost his life because of that. And in The Praise of Folly, he denounced war, ignorance, prejudice, and religious corruption. And those are the themes that he taught on, that he wrote about and spoke about for the rest of his life. So while it was a humorous book and people enjoyed it because of that, in reality, he was denouncing all of these evils of society. His book was so popular that it was second only to the Bible in the number of books that were printed by the very new printing press. So Erasmus is a leading scholar and writer of Renaissance humanism.